to the sky of stars and caught the red-hot light of the North Star. The earth, rocking with blood-soaked feet. She challenged the whip, the gun, the knife. She challenged the fire, pulled from the bodies of slaves, made into laws, prisons, and courts. Screaming white-hot flames and agony, she challenged millions of headhunters, dragging and ripping apart impossible tender moments of time, shipping vessels of history, ancient history, destroying the fabric, the godlike claw of destiny of a people with a gun, a knife, a cannon, building the hideous wall of blood called slavery. She challenged it with burning eyes and black skin, torn skin, whipped skin, degraded skin, smashed skin, dehumanized skin, dehumanized skin. Strong enough to bring a fee, strong enough to be free. To be free. To be free, strong enough to bring a fee, strong enough to be free.
Good morning. We are now 13 days away from Trump 47 or Trump Redux. MAGA, Make America Great Again, as you all know, is the mantra. Well, what does this mean in the context of imperialism, the maintenance and extension of power over foreign nations, particularly through expansionism, employing both hard power such as military and economic, and soft power such as diplomatic and cultural influence? What does this mean in the context of colonialism or neocolonialism, acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it economically? Are the objectives of American presidents the objectives of empire? And the differences of specific administrations, are they more about the differences over approach, form over substance? Let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. Here's the point. We have a tendency to view current events as though they take place in a vacuum, failing to understand the broader historic context in which most events take place. During each episode, my guests and I have probing, provocative, and in-depth discussions that connect the dots between these events and the broader historic context in which they occur, thus enabling you to better understand and analyze these events that are impacting the global village in which we live. On today's episode, the issue before us is Trump 47 or Trump Redux. MAGA, Make America Great Again. What does this mean in the broader context of American empire, imperialism, colonialism, neocolonialism? My guest is the founder of the Center for Political Innovation. He's an author, independent journalist, political analyst. His latest book is entitled Out of the Movement to the Masses, Anti-Imperialist Organizing in America. And may I say, I consider him to be a dear friend. Caleb Maupin, as always, my brother. Happy New Year to you, first of all. And
sure.
Welcome back.
Sure. Glad to be here, and Happy New Year to you.
Thank you. Thank you. So let's start with the Center for Political Innovation. What is it and why was it formed?
Well, we were formed because we see an urgent need to spread anti-imperialist politics. We've raised the slogan, we need a government of action to fight for working families. And we've engaged in all kinds of great, exciting activities. We publish books. We put on conferences. You've spoken at, I think, one of our conferences we did when Joe Biden had his summit for democracy. We had a summit against hypocrisy to counter it in Washington, D.C. We are advocates of America joining the exciting new economy that's rising around the world and rejecting the dying Western financial system. We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need to oppose the danger of a new world war and the emerging low-wage police state. So, yeah, anti-imperialism is the future, and that the future of America is not tied up with this dying Western financial system, the British Empire that the American Revolution was fought against. There's a new exciting economy rising with the BRICS, with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the Eurasian Economic Union and the axis of resistance in the Middle East. And rather than joining with the international bankers and Wall Street monopolies and trying to crush the rising new economy, I think the future of the United States is joining with that new economy. And we've done a lot of exciting things. We were in the streets of Manhattan marching around with a picture of Trump and Kim shaking hands, saying only peace can make America great again. We did that in October. We were big supporters of the Uhuru movement. I was going to all their court dates, etc., and standing with them as they faced that FBI raid and indictment. So anything we can do to stand against imperialism and try to push the United States into line with the new economy and against the dying international colonial system, anything we can do that is what we're looking to do, and a lot of education, a lot of workshops, etc.
And you have an event coming up on the 20th of January, I believe, the day of inauguration for Trump 47.
Yeah, well, that's kind of exciting. So we got a hotel just a couple blocks from the White House, and we're having an event called A New Day for America, A New Hope for World Peace. And we are going to be in DC with our big banner of Trump and Kim shaking hands. We also have a new banner promoting the Peace Bridge, the idea of a bridge connecting Russia and the United States through Alaska over the Bering Sea. And we're going to have those two big banners. We're going to be out in the streets in the morning around the time of the inauguration. We have a special pamphlet we've printed 2,000 copies of we'll be handing out. And then that evening, we're having a reception at Hilton Garden Inn, just a few blocks from the White House. Speeches, music, free food for the first 100 people. And it's going to be good food because the hotel is charging us a food minimum in order to be open on inauguration day. So we had to spend quite a bit of money on the food. So it's going to be good food if you join us. So I'm looking forward to it.
And you have extended an invitation to me, and I'm doing everything in my power to be in attendance. So
great.
So in spite of me, it'll still have, I think, a bang up event. Let me start with this. There's a lot of hand wringing going on in a lot of circles. Trump 47, Trump Redux. There are a lot of adjectives being bandied about. For example, according to Senator Lindsey Graham, we go back to, I love this quote from Lindsey Graham: Trump's a race-baiting, xenophobic bigot. He doesn't represent my party. This is Lindsey Graham. He doesn't represent the values that the men and women who wear the uniform are fighting for. He's the ISIL man of the year, end quote. All of that's true, in my humble opinion. But in the broader context of the geopolitical landscape, should that be our focus, or is that really more of a distraction? Because that, to me, doesn't speak to substantive policy, which is what I think we should really be focused on.
Well, what I've always said about Donald Trump is one of the big criticisms of him that we constantly hear is that he's only in it for himself. He's not a team player. And I think that's our best hope. I hope that Donald Trump is as selfish as he can possibly be. I hope that Donald Trump is more concerned with how he's remembered in the history books than going along with the overall agenda of American imperialism, etc. And I hope that Donald Trump is thinking, how can I be remembered as a great man in office? How can I be remembered as a peacemaker? How can I be remembered as somebody who improved conditions for working people? I hope that Donald Trump is as selfish of a politician as he can be, and as unwilling to play ball with the political establishment as he can be. And that's my hope. And I'm inspired by the fact that even though the Wall Street Journal criticized him for continuing to brag about his peace efforts on the Korean Peninsula, that he continued bragging about it, and he continues to uphold that. And he's even announced it's become clear that he intends to try and restart the peace talks on the Korean Peninsula. It looks like there was an attempted military coup in South Korea in anticipation of Donald Trump taking office because of that. And we saw the Biden administration taking some pretty wild moves and prosecuting top Korea advisors and others. And it looks like there is a possibility that the USA could move toward peace on the Korean Peninsula and also could withdraw forces from South Korea. Apparently, Donald Trump is talking about making South Korea pay to have the U.S. troops there, which they may not want to do. And I mean, there is real possibility we could see a unified Korea. And I'm very hopeful about that. And there are other things about Trump. Trump has said he wants to end this war in Ukraine, that he can make a deal. Well,
I think you hit your mute button there. One more time. You're still muted. There you go. Oh, we're not hearing you. So do we need to restart? Because it's not showing that you're muted. Why don't you back out and log back in? Okay, there we go. So let me try to pick up from that point until Caleb comes back. First of all, good morning to you all. And I found it very interesting. Oh, that was really quickly. So let's see if we can get him back in and try that again.
Can you hear me now?
We hear you now. Go ahead.
Very good. Oh yeah.
So
Well,
pick up with the reunification. We lost you right as you were talking about the reunification of the Koreas.
yeah. Well, we saw, Biden prosecuted Sue Mi Terry, and Sue Mi Terry is not a supporter of North Korea by any means. She was the top Korea advisor. She's a longtime CIA operative. She was an advisor to the Bush White House and the Obama White House on South Korea. But they've charged her with being a foreign agent under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. And shortly after she was charged, we saw the government of South Korea take moves that were kind of contrary to what the United States wanted. Biden wanted to escalate against North Korea and wanted South Korea to cooperate with him in escalating against North Korea in response to Putin's visit to North Korea. And South Korea, they escalated a little bit, but then they stopped. And then more recently, we saw that attempted coup by President Yoon, the conservative president who was leaving office, was wildly unpopular. He instituted martial law and it didn't go. And now they're trying to prosecute him for that martial law. And there's a political crisis now in South Korea, which if you look on it, it's very clearly in anticipation of Trump entering the White House. They're anticipating Donald Trump entering the White House because Trump has said he wants South Korea to either start paying to have military forces from the United States there, or he's going to start withdrawing the U.S. military presence in South Korea. And Donald Trump has said he wants to start peace talks with North Korea up again, and he's made that clear. So that's very exciting. I think it's also very exciting that Trump has said that he will resolve the conflict in Ukraine. Russia has said the first offer that was made was not satisfactory, and that makes sense to me. That's how negotiations work. You don't just, immediately go with the first offer that's on the table. And Russia has sacrificed a lot in Donbass. A lot of lives have been lost and a lot has been done. So they're not just going to immediately agree to whatever is offered, right? So this is a negotiation process, but they've been wanting to negotiate from the beginning, and Biden hasn't been willing to negotiate. And Trump is willing to negotiate, and Russia is now willing to negotiate. And getting a seat at the table is the first step. And the hope is that the conflict can either be frozen or ultimately resolved. Some kind of deal can be made. I think that Donald Trump represents, there are big divisions within the American elite right now, and that he represents a faction that has a different financial interest overall than some of the big monopolies do. I mean, this Canadian trade deal thing, this is wild. The fact that we have, the Prime Minister of Canada stepping down because Trump is negotiating these tariffs. And I mean, this is wild. I mean, with the coup in South Korea, with the Canadian Prime Minister stepping down, and now if you look at all these wild terrorist attacks that we've had and all that, it looks like there is a lot of fear on the part of many forces of what this administration could bring. And that makes me think we could actually see some positive change. Now, I don't like Marco Rubio, and I certainly don't agree with a lot of what Trump is saying about economics, along with Elon Musk. So I'm willing and prepared to be disappointed. But I am of the attitude that we shouldn't give up immediately. And if it looks like we could see a unified Korea, we could see an end to the conflict in Ukraine, or at least a de-escalation or freezing. There's potential for good to happen. So I'm open to that.
Your thoughts on what I said in the open about administrations and their objectives juxtaposed to American foreign policy? Because particularly over the last, let's say 20 years, as the Republicans and the Democratic parties have moved closer in lockstep, what we really seem to have is a control of the elite, and administrations articulate policy, but at the end of the day, we really don't see a whole lot of difference between administrations as it relates to policy. Is that fair to say? Is that too simplistic, Caleb Maupin?
Well, there's a couple factors. First, every president we've had going back to Bush, has promised no regime change wars and done the opposite. Every single one. I mean, George W. Bush said he was against nation building, and then he took office and did Afghanistan and Iraq. Barack Obama came into office saying he was not going to be Bush, and he overthrew the Libyan government and, spread the drones around the world and started the Syrian conflict. And Trump, when he first came into office the first time, he said he was gonna stop toppling regimes, and we know about his efforts against Venezuela, how he murdered Qasem Soleimani, the important leader of the Islamic Revolution of Iran, and just ruined any hope for peace negotiations and improving relations with Iran. Biden, when Biden came in, Anthony Blinken got up and said, "Oh, we are done engaging in regime change." And we know that was certainly a bunch of malarkey if we've ever heard it. There was a huge escalation of international tensions under Biden, with Anthony Blinken running the State Department. So that's clearly what the American people want to hear. And public opinion polls confirm that. Overwhelmingly, the American people want a change to the foreign policy. They see things like the bridge in Baltimore collapsing and the power grid in Texas collapsing a few years ago, and our roads and bridges crumbling. And they say, why are we spending so much money on all these wars around the world when our country is falling apart domestically? This doesn't make sense. So that's what the American people want to hear. That said, there is an international financial apparatus that is very much being defended by these wars. I mean, the reason that Gaddafi in Libya was overthrown is because his government was moving to implement an independent African currency. They had taken control of their own oil resources. They had built the world's largest irrigation system, the Great Man-Made River, and they were a country that was independent of the Western financial system. So they were targeted. And you can look at many examples of this. And the countries that get targeted are countries that are competitors, that break out of the dominance of Wall Street and London. It is this kind of international financial system that is defending itself from any opposition that targets independent governments. And that's pretty clear. Now, Trump, it appears, while he certainly is a wealthy guy and he's part of that system, he's not as much of a team player overall. And, if you look at the way he's talking to South Korea, if you look at the way he's talking to Canada, he, has his own interest, and he's not concerned about kind of maintaining the relationships that have been built up for geopolitical purposes. And he's more concerned about stimulating the domestic economy. He's made clear he wants domestic energy corporations to get priority. The tariffs, he's talking about imposing tariffs to boost American manufacturers and American energy companies, et cetera. And I think Donald Trump is not as much of a team player with his overall international system and its agenda, and he's much more concerned with making profits for a set of more domestic-oriented manufacturers. And that is an opening that those of us who see that the future of America is joining with the new emerging international system, with BRICS and with the countries that are rising up from poverty, with the wave of African countries that are teaming up with Russia and China to rise. I think there's an opening for us to kind of put forward that message that is the future. But that said, I mean, Donald Trump says things about the Israel-Palestine conflict that I'm certainly horrified by and not thrilled with. His policies toward Iran in his first administration were horrendous, and they don't sound like they're going to be better. So there's plenty that we can look at Trump and not be thrilled about. And it seems like many of the people in his administration really do believe that free markets are magic, right? And if we just abolish government jobs and all of that, we can somehow get economic growth. Well, you can't cut your way into economic growth. You never get more by having less. And on the right, that's called austerity. It's this idea that we just fire all these government employees and we cut government spending, magically the economy will get better. Doesn't work. On the left, it's called degrowth. It's this idea that if we reduce consumption and we cut spending and we reduce electrification and we reduce the amount of power, that'll be good for the environment and somehow we'll be better. And that doesn't work either. You never have more with less. But that is what the international monopolies and the big corporations want. They want less because if the world continues to grow, it'll no longer be under their domination, right? We're moving toward a multipolar world. Countries are rising up from poverty around the world and electrifying and building and constructing. And pretty soon, Wall Street and London are not going to be the center of the world economy. There's going to be other poles. Africa is going to rise. China and Russia are already rising. South America, Latin America is rising. and that there's going to be more poles of power in the world, and that's just the reality. But Wall Street and London are saying, no, we're going to stay at the top of the mountain, the top of the hill forever, and that means growth around the world must stop, and so less is better. Well, less is not better, and the world is continuing to rise. The nature of humanity is wanting more than you have, building, constructing. So as a result of that, we see this kind of this drive for less. And I'm certainly concerned. Elon Musk seems to very much be an advocate of austerity economics, and that's not the future. I mean, if you look at the United States, I mean, a great example, Trump wants to get rid of the Department of Education. We talked about that on a previous conversation you and I had. You know, I mean, the United States, our education is a disaster, no question about it, but it's more private and for profit than any other Western country. We have schools for profit, charter schools. We have implemented school choice like you wouldn't believe since the 1980s. Our efforts to improve the American educational system have been cutting the wages of teachers, cutting government spending, privatizing, and it's only gotten worse. So if the answer was to get the government out of education, education should have improved a lot, but it's actually much worse. And if you go to other Western countries where the state is more involved in the educational process, they have a better education system. So, you know, the idea that free markets and privatizing things is the answer and that we can cut our way into economic growth, it's not going to work. I would say what we need instead is we need a state that is actively investing in the population. We need a government that is actively building roads and building power plants, building new universities, building high-speed railway, funding scientific research, et cetera. I think we need a state that is actively trying to lay the basis of physical economy by building infrastructure, by expanding living standards for the population. And, you know, I feel like the way we talk about these things is not correct. You know, the way we talk about healthcare and education, right, is that, you know, conservatives say, well, you got to pay for that yourself. You got to just work hard and pay for that yourself. And among the left, the attitude is, well, big corporations get free things. They get handouts all the time, which is true. So why shouldn't the population get handouts all the time? Why shouldn't, you know, if corporations get tax breaks and corporate government subsidies, why shouldn't we get healthcare and education? I don't think that's the right approach. We shouldn't view it as a handout. Rather, we should view it as an investment because it is the people. It is human labor power that is the source of all wealth. So if we provide our population with healthcare, that's in order to make them healthier, and it should be prevention focused. It shouldn't be focused on treating disease. It should be, focused on creating a healthy lifestyle so that people are stronger and productive, and they can go out and work very hard and have new ideas and create and generate more wealth. We should view education in the same way. To have a strong, productive economy, we need educated people. So we should view these things as an investment because our greatest asset is our people. Human labor is the source of all wealth. Human creativity and innovation is where new wealth and new prosperity is generated. And so we should view it that way. Unfortunately, our leaders have a Malthusian perspective. They view human beings as the problem. They think the economic problems of the world are rooted in the fact that there are too many people in the world. I think that's fundamentally wrong. People are the source of wealth, but this Malthusian perspective that says growth is bad, that human beings are a horde, an obnoxious horde to be managed. They're a cancer on the planet. They need to be gotten rid of. This is the old British Empire imperialist Malthusian perspective, and it's the main barrier to the world rising. And if you look at Russia and China, and if you look at the countries around the world that have broken out of this system, they very much have the opposite perspective. They want to have more people. They incentivize their population to have more children and to grow because they believe in economic growth, and they understand that you need a state that is actively controlling the economy to make sure that that growth is carried out. So there you go.
Well, and I think a good example, a good current example of what you've just articulated is this discussion over the H-1B1 visa, because we hear from Silicon Valley out in California that there aren't enough trained engineers, American-born engineers, to meet the job demands, to meet the employment requirements of these Silicon Valley corporations. So they say, we've got to go abroad to bring these engineers in. And where are they coming from? Well, they're coming primarily from India, and many of them are coming from China. Well, when you look at the education systems in India, look at the education system in China, and compare that to the education system in the United States, you can pretty much put your finger on why there's such a problem in accessing American engineers. And I would say they're pretty much talking about white engineers. But they don't want to connect these dots. They don't want to connect the dots between education and having problem accessing educated individuals to do the job in your country that need to be done. Caleb Maupin.
Well, yeah, since the Cold War, we have had policies of brain drain. And brain drain was a Cold War strategy. You read Brzezinski, I mean, he openly admits this. The idea was that, these countries around the world that have communist governments, the population overall benefits when you implement, when the Soviet Union, emerged, the result was industrialization, raising living standards. And, when Eastern European countries moved toward, socialism after the Cold War, after the Second World War, the rise of various Eastern European Marxist governments, it tended to raise living standards, but certain professionals, their living standards went down because, and that these communist governments did a lot to educate their population. They did a lot to provide education, and there's like a surplus of doctors if you go to Cuba today, et cetera. And the idea was brain drain, lure those, those educated folks, those engineers, those scientists, those doctors from the developing world, lure them to the West. And that hurts the countries around the world that would want to move towards socialism or develop a state-run economy because they don't have the engineers and the scientists and the doctors they need, and lure them to the United States and have a place for them here. Well, that has been the policy of the United States, and it's been very effective because, we know the Berlin Wall was erected for a reason. It was to keep people in. Most people did not want to leave East Germany, but it was the doctors and the scientists and the engineers who could make more money if they came to the United States. They're the ones who wanted to leave, right? And so brain drain was a very effective policy in keeping countries in the developing world impoverished, and not just communist countries. India, Nigeria, places like that. That's where these governments were trying their hardest to lift their country up and providing education to their people. And the United States then, with the brain drain policy, lured those people to the United States and they had a place in the United States. Meanwhile, our own education system was getting worse and worse and worse. And that's okay, because we didn't need to train our own engineers. We didn't need to train our own scientists and doctors. We could just import them from the developing world and from the communist world. And we could just import them. And it was kind of
and pay for them.
What's that?
And pay less for them.
Indeed. And this is a problem. So on the one hand, I understand why people are upset, but it's not a problem you can undo in one day, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the thing. Like the idea we're just going to stop it. Well, we don't. Silicon Valley is not lying when they say we don't have the engineers, we don't have the educated people. We don't. We just don't have them. And so you can't just cut off the program and say, there's a lot that has to change in order to address this. Yes, we should be educating our own population so that we churn out among the domestic population the engineers and scientists we need. But our education system is not doing that. And, to just kind of announce, we're going to stop, that would be an economic disaster. So I sympathize with what people that are opposing the visa program are saying. They're pointing to a very, very big problem that was engineered for foreign policy reasons and has hurt countries across the developing world and has hurt America and has allowed our education system to rot. But I don't think you're going to solve it with one change in immigration policy. You're not going to solve it because we don't have the engineers and scientists that we need. We just don't. And we have an educational system in this country that's a disaster. And culturally, we have a culture. We've kind of created a culture where we don't really value education. That was one thing Vivek Ramaswamy said, where I think he was right. There's a bigger problem. It's not simply that our education system is flawed. There's also a cultural issue. So I don't disagree with what was said there, but at the same time, it's part of a bigger problem. I can see both sides of that issue. They're pointing to the fact that, again, the problem is imperialism. The problem is this financial system where Wall Street and London dominate the world and keep the world poor so that they can make themselves rich. And that system is not good for the American people, and it's not good for people around the world, and it's a dying system, and we need to move away from it.
And elaborate a little more on the problem is imperialism, because the deindustrialization of the United States was a strategy, was a policy. It didn't happen by accident. Capitalists decided we are going to ship these jobs overseas so that we can make more money. The disincentive to educate in the United States, it didn't happen by accident. It's a policy. And so one of the problems that I see is we're now suffering from the repercussions of intended policy. People could have told you in the 1970s that this was going to happen, but because the pursuit of profit, because the pursuit of imperialism was the objective, then folks didn't really care. And now, to a point you made a little earlier, using China as an example, the countries that saw the problems on the horizon and adjusted their social constructs to address them are now thriving. China has moved, 900 million people out of abject poverty since the 1980s? And the United States can't deal with 80,000? It's called planning. It's called policy in lieu of profit. Caleb.
Sure. When I talk about imperialism, what people need to understand is that imperialism is about holding back development and stopping economic growth, because we have it in our head that imperialism is about growth. We have it, oh, the American corporations, they go to Haiti and they give people jobs and all of that. No. Imperialism is, the people in Mexico. They've been growing their own food since long before Christopher Columbus showed up. But thanks to NAFTA, now American agribusiness dominates the Mexican food market. All the domestic Mexican farmers have pretty much been, put out of business, and American agribusiness dominates the Mexican agricultural sector. 100 years earlier, the British Empire conquered India. And the people in India, they've been growing their own food, and they've been weaving on looms for thousands of years. And so when the British got to India, did they say to the Indian people, oh, great, go to work and start weaving for us? No, they burned all the looms. They burned the looms, and they forced the people of India to import their cloth from British manufacturers. The country in Africa that has the highest oil output at this point is Nigeria. And Nigeria is a very, very wealthy country. The Niger Delta region has a huge amount of oil. But if you go to Nigeria, you will see a very, very low life expectancy. You will see a very, very low rate of literacy. You will see a very high infant mortality rate. And why is that? That's because the profits from the oil of Nigeria don't go into Nigeria's economy. They go into the pockets of ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, and Chevron. And that imperialism, you talk about the export of capital, the essence of it is extraction of natural resources and the prevention of economic development in countries around the world. That is what imperialism is. And, the Chinese, they fought 2 opium wars. And what were the opium wars about? It was that the British wanted to force China to accept domination by British banks. HSBC Bank. What does HSBC stand for? It stands for Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation. It's not a Chinese bank. It's a British bank that was set up to dominate China's economy, largely with the drug trade, with opium. And the Chinese emperors, they didn't want it. And so the British fought 2 wars to force them to accept free trade. And as a result, China was the sick man of Asia and deeply impoverished and kept in poverty. But they've had a revolution. And it's since they broke out of imperialism and Western domination, they've been able to build their economy up. The essence of imperialism is holding back development. conflict. And that's a really important thing, because on the right, you'll hear a defense of imperialism. They say, well, imperialism is bringing development. It's helping these countries rise up from poverty. No, it is not. It is keeping these countries in poverty. And on the left, you'll hear an echoing of the same thing. They just think development is somehow bad. And, these are beautiful indigenous people, and that they don't need electricity and they don't need modernization. And that's wrong as well, right? Imperialism is about holding back development, and the struggle against imperialism, the struggle against colonialism, has largely been a fight to bring electrification, bring modern industrialization, bring education and literacy, and raise countries up from poverty, to break them out of Western imperialist domination so they can industrialize and develop, which is what imperialism prevents them from doing. That's an important thing. You want to see, imperialism. I tell people, take a look at Central America. Look at Honduras, which is under the domination of Western imperialism, United States capitalism. Look at Guatemala, another country that's been very impoverished and suffered. And then look at Nicaragua, a country that broke free from imperialism with their 1979 revolution, a country led by the Sandinistas. And it's night and day. Nicaragua, they've wiped out illiteracy. They've electrified the entire country. They have amazing roads. They grow their own food and have a
food security
agricultural sector. Their life expectancy and living standard is much higher because they've broken out of Western domination. Whereas the Guatemalans and Hondurans are still living in poverty. You have a lot of people who don't speak Spanish. They still speak indigenous languages. They don't have running water. They don't have electricity, drug violence and gangs, and they're fleeing to our U.S. border. There's a refugee crisis. That's because they've been prevented from developing their own economy, and they've become impoverished. And there's many examples of this, from around the world. Prior to 2011, Libya, under Gaddafi's leadership, had the highest life expectancy in Africa. People all over Africa were trying to get to Libya because the oil wealth under the control of Gaddafi's Islamic socialist government was being used to build up a strong, vibrant economy. 2011, the United States bombed and destroyed Libya, and Libya has been a mess of chaos ever since. But when their economy was strong, it was because they had broken out of imperialist domination. And we need to get away from this belief that somehow imperialism is about development, or somehow development is imperialism. We need to stop thinking about the movie Avatar. The movie Avatar, that's a nice fantasy, dances with wolves or whatever, these beautiful indigenous people that don't have technology. That's a very much a middle-class white fantasy is largely what that is. That's not what the economics of imperialism are about. Countries that break out of imperialism do it because imperialism is keeping them from developing, and they are fighting to develop by seizing control of their own industries and building themselves up.
There are two comments here, both from Zhao Yun, and I want to bring these up because, to me, they speak volumes to these misconceptions. Zhao Yun says, when I said China has brought 900 million people out of abject poverty since the 80s, the response is hundreds of millions of people in China are still very poor. Yeah, that's true. But that does not negate the reality, the fact that I stated. And when you look at the size of China, that's how many people are in China? A billion people in China? So stating that hundreds of millions are still very poor, that's a fact, but that does not negate the reality that through planning, through restraints on capitalism, through investing in the people in the country, that 800 million people have been brought out of abject poverty. And when you compare that to the United States, that can't deal with 80,000, but the United States still wants to point to China as an enemy, there's a flaw in that argument. That response is incredibly simplistic. And Caleb, as you were talking about Nigeria and the oil wealth in Nigeria, and the fact that the indigenous Nigerians are not benefiting from the oil revenues and wealth in their country, Zhao Yun writes, a lot of that is due to the Nigerian government. Well, that's true. But who is responsible for putting in individuals in Nigeria, in their government, and excluding people? The United States, big oil, whose interests are being served by those in the Nigerian government. And an example of that, we can look at what's happening in the Sahel states. We can look at what's happening in Niger. We can look at what's happening in Mali. We can look at what's happening in Burkina Faso. As those folks are kicking out the colonial power and trying to establish themselves as their own government to benefit their own people, it's Western interests that are backing Muslim extremists to overthrow those governments. So stop with this simplistic BS, please. That's not what this show is about. Stop with that. Listen to what this brother is saying, because he's making sense. Caleb Maupin.
Well, sure. I mean, the reason that the Nigerian government is corrupt is because the United States is heavily involved in making sure it stays that way. And I mean, how many dictators and governments has the United States imposed all throughout Africa, et cetera? I mean, in Nigeria in particular, you have a situation where, you know, there's the Boko Haram terrorist group that has ties to Saudi Arabia. It's a Wahhabi extremist organization. They've been done horrendous things on a local level, and they have a lot of power. And then in Zaria, in Nigeria, you had a movement that emerged. It's called the Islamic Movement of Nigeria. And these were Shia Muslims that were taking inspiration from the Islamic Republic of Iran. And they were bringing Christians and Muslims together. And after the Iran nuclear deal was signed, the Nigerian government, in coordination with the CIA and with the American government, and also with the Saudis, they went and raided and crushed this anti-imperialist, stronghold of Zaria, and they held without charges the Islamic leader Sheikh Ibrahim Zakzaki. They held him without charges for years. The military just held him arbitrarily because they considered him to be, a supporter of Iran, and because he was building this anti-colonial movement that was bringing Christians and Muslims together. And the Nigerian state, as it currently exists, is very much propped up by the American government. There's U.S. military forces in Nigeria advising their military on what to do. I believe there's even U.S. drones flying in the skies of Nigeria. So yes, it's because of the Nigerian government, you can be sure, but that's not an independent government. And that takes us back to what I think is the interesting thing. A lot of what the American government does is go all over the world and manage other people's governments and destabilize countries and try to prop up this global international system. Whereas domestically, our economy is falling apart, and a lot of American working families are really struggling right now. But on top of that, a lot of American capitalists and manufacturers are losing out. And I view Trump and his rise as a result of some of the American manufacturers and some of the energy companies and some of the American corporations saying, look, I would prefer that the American government focus on raising our profits and not managing this international system. And there's kind of a division. The frackers are big supporters of Donald Trump, the fracking companies. And they have supported Donald Trump because they're more concerned with extracting oil from the shale beneath the American soil than they are with kind of managing the control of the global oil trade. And that you saw a lot of these companies that were big supporters of Trump, like the Koch brothers and others, they were tied into the fracking industry, and they wanted to see higher oil prices. Whereas the big oil manufacturers, they want to drop the oil prices to put their competitors out of business. They want to maintain their monopoly. So the lower the oil prices are, the more they can secure their monopoly, because the fracking companies and their competitors and independent countries that have seized control of their oil resources, like Russia and Iran and Venezuela, they'll lose money and they can kind of secure their monopoly. So under the Obama administration, you saw a very dramatic drop in oil prices. I mean, it was unbelievable. I mean, you could go to Kentucky Fried Chicken, and you could get a family meal that cost more than a barrel of oil. It was below $30 a barrel. It was like $27 a barrel. It was ridiculous. And that was good for big oil because it secured their monopoly. And a lot of fracking companies went out of business, and Venezuela had big problems, etc. However, under Trump, you see a push for high oil prices. Trump wants the oil prices to go up, probably because that's to the benefit of people like the Koch brothers and people that are, from the lower levels, the fracking companies, Noble Energy, etc. So there's kind of a push and pull, and that in America, we've always had what people kind of refer to as the old right. Right? We have the neocons and irregular Republicans, the Ronald Reagan people, but there's also a layer of people when you talk about the old right, the John Birch Society, people like that. And those kind of folks have always, they're certainly believers in capitalism. They're certainly, supporters of capitalism and all of that, but they've always kind of had an agenda that's out of step with the overall agenda of imperialism, right? The John Birch Society thought the Rockefellers were communist. They thought the United Nations was communist, right? And that they kind of represent lower level capitalists who are kind of at odds with the American establishment. And Trump is kind of the expression of those lower level capitalists that have an agenda that is at odds with the overall agenda of American imperialism. And the way Elon Musk kind of repeats a lot of like old right and libertarian talking points, again, this points to a division in the ruling class. But I think the fundamental issue is that the big monopolies have determined that the way they can stay at the top of the world is to freeze growth, to stop economic growth so that they can stay at the top, right? They openly talk about this. If you read, Foreign Affairs magazine was pushing slow growth, a world beyond growth, and they've openly kind of determined that in order to keep themselves at the top, they need to stop economic growth around the world, and they need to kind of freeze development. They're pushing the idea that because of climate change and also because of artificial intelligence and all of that, we just need to all just accept, being poorer. They say you'll own nothing, you'll live in a pod, you'll eat bugs, you'll own nothing, you'll be happy about it. That's the ultra rich, the big monopolies in their agenda. Whereas many of the lower levels of capital just want to make money. And because they just want to make money and they believe in economic growth, because that's how they will make money, that puts them at odds with the overall agenda of imperialism, and that this is the divide. And that creates an opening for us, because at the end of the day, the only way you can have economic growth is you need a state that is actively controlling the economy and investing in the population. And that's why China and Russia and countries like that continue to grow and rise up from poverty. And that what's interesting is, in China, there are a lot of capitalists, a lot of private business owners who are very much, love the Chinese government, because the Chinese government is controlling the economy and enabling them to make lots of money and planning out the economy with 5-year plans and making sure that the GDP is constantly rising, et cetera. And that 21st century socialism, involves a lot of private profits being made by corporations, but it involves a state that comes out of an anti-colonial revolution that is actively organizing and planning the economy to make sure there's economic growth. And so there's kind of a clash going on. This old Western system is dying, whereas there is a rising alternative around the world. And I think that all lays the basis for some new exciting developments. Ultimately, the people of the United States have got to be angry right now. I tell people that if you're a parent and your child is going to school, and they don't have proper clothing, it's wintertime, it's cold, they don't have any gloves, they're cold. If your child's not eating properly, you will be arrested. And what will you be arrested for? Well, you won't be arrested for what you did. You'll be arrested for what you didn't do. You will have engaged in criminal neglect. Well, I would argue that the government of the United States is guilty of criminal neglect at this time. If you look at communities throughout this country where the bridges and highways are falling apart, where the living standards are going down, where the opioid epidemic has consumed lives, our government is completely in dereliction of duty. It's guilty of criminal neglect. Living standards are going down. The population is getting poorer. And meanwhile, our government is so focused on waging wars around the world and fighting against Russia and Ukraine and fighting against Iran with the Israelis and fighting against China on the island of Taiwan. Meanwhile, our domestic economy is suffering. Our government is guilty of criminal neglect, and we need to just demand that the government do otherwise and say the government should be focused on providing a good life for working families right here, not protecting an international financial system that is not to our benefit. And that is the message of the Center for Political Innovation that we have raised very loudly.
And, to your point about Nigeria, another real-time example of what you're articulating is what the United States right now is doing in Haiti. You've got soldiers from Guatemala, you've got soldiers from El Salvador that the United States is now sending into Haiti to recolonize that country. And they won't allow for free and fair elections. The United States won't allow for democracy in Haiti. Instead of allowing that, the United States went to Kenya, paid President William Ruto to send Kenyan forces into Haiti. They've now gotten Guatemalans and they've gotten El Salvadorians to go in there. That's just another. And look at what, of course, the United States is backing in occupied Palestine. That's another example of what we're talking about here. Daniel Drazinovich has a super sticker. Thank you so much, Daniel, for that. And asked the question, what does Caleb think of tariffs on Canada? Daniel lives in Canada, and we do not have a government at the present moment because Trudeau stepped down. I think it's also important, as you answer that question, Caleb, to realize that Trudeau went to Mar-a-Lago, met with Trump, kissed the ring, and still is now on the outs as Donald Trump is talking about imposing tariffs not only on Canada, but on a whole lot of countries. He's slightly changing his tune. He's moderating or modulating his message about it's not now going to be tariffs on all products. Now some sense of reality, I think, is starting to enter into the conversation about how crazy these tariffs would be. Caleb Maupin.
Well, when it comes to tariffs, I think it's on a case-by-case basis. In some cases, they might be good. In some cases, they might be bad. What it appears to me when I look at the Canada situation is that to some degree or other, the United States has propped up Canada's economy because Canada is basically under American domination, right? Whenever we have a war, whenever we need support at the UN, Canada just kind of echoes American foreign policy. Canada really kind of does what the United States wants. And because of that, we give Canada some economic benefits, right? There has been kind of a relationship. And I think Donald Trump is saying, I'm not concerned about keeping Canada under U.S. domination. I'm not concerned about Canada echoing the United States at the UN and all of that. I'm more concerned about the fact that American manufacturers are not getting as much money as they possibly could. So I'm going to, drive a mean deal, and I'm going to, cut Canada out of some of the economic benefits they've gotten over the years. And that's not going to be good for the Canadian economy if that's the case. And I think, again, Donald Trump is just not as much of a team player. What I find to be interesting is that Donald Trump's tweets that he made alluded to the idea that Canada should become part of the United States. He didn't directly say it, but he hinted at it. Mm-hmm. And that I found to be very interesting because of the fact that we know this Canadian trucker convoy, a lot of them were calling for Canada to be invaded by the United States. And a lot of them were big supporters of Donald Trump. A lot of them were connected with the QAnon protests. And it seems like there is a big division within the American establishment and within the Canadian establishment. And that, while Trump seems to want to put more tariffs on Canada, he seems to very much be entertaining the notion that Canada should become part of the United States. If you look at the way the population in Canada is distributed, there is a huge amount of vacant land in Canada. Let's just be real about that. A huge amount of land that is, it's very cold and it's not very inhabitable and all of that. And, if you get up there by Alaska and all of that, Canada's got a lot of people in Ontario. It's got a lot of people in Toronto. It's got a lot of people in Quebec. But you get north, there's a lot of vacant land. I am sure there's a lot of fracking companies that really want to get some of that natural gas that's underneath the soil. And I can bet there's a lot of mineral wealth in Canada that is also at this point untapped. We also know that there's been a lot of anger among the Indigenous population in Canada. There's a lot of revelations about what went on at some of the schools for Indigenous people, etc. And it looks to me like Canada is increasingly becoming some kind of political battlefield, and that different factions within the American elite and different factions within the Canadian elite have different plans for the future of Canada and what Canada should be economically speaking. And that I find to be very interesting. There was talk of the trucker convoy saying they wanted the United States to invade Canada. There were Indigenous groups that were angry at the government. There was even some unity between Indigenous groups and these right-wing truckers at some points, and there's was church burnings throughout Canada. And I'm curious what all of this will lead to. It seems like there's some political intrigue going on, and that Canada could be a battleground very, very soon. And the fact that the prime minister has just stepped down in anticipation of Trump taking office, that tells me that there's some big drama coming to Canada pretty soon. We should keep our eye on it.
And you can't look at those tweets related to Canada in isolation. You've got to connect some dots, because he's talking about buying Greenland. He's talking about reclaiming the Panama Canal. You can't look at these things as disjointed. There's a mindset here that I think you have to pay very close attention to.
Indeed. I mean, yeah, Donald Trump is certainly, he's known for dog whistling different people. They talk about a dog whistle, you blow into it and the dog goes, it hurts the dog's ears, but we can't hear anything. And that, Donald Trump will say things that please certain people. He'll use certain phrases that may sound completely innocuous to us, but there's a certain constituency that really wants to hear them. I mean, when it comes to Elon Musk, I remember, a couple, maybe a year before the election, the auto workers in Michigan were on strike, and Donald Trump went up there to support the UAW workers. And in his speech, he bashed electric cars. He said electric cars are crap. We hate electric cars. And he was pandering to a lot of the auto workers who don't like the transition to electric cars, and they don't like having to make electric car batteries when they've been making cars that run on fossil fuels for years. But then Elon Musk became Donald Trump's best pal, and now Donald Trump loves electric cars, and Donald Trump's all about electric cars because Elon Musk, his backer, Tesla, they're all about electric cars, and Trump dramatically changed his tune when it came to electric cars. I think because he got different backers and he got different supporters. And that's interesting to me, and that Donald Trump is always trying to please a number of different constituents. His coalition is very broad and diverse, and some people want some things and some people want other things. And it'll be interesting to see what the policies actually are. His tweets are wild, I think, because he's trying to signal to lots of different people that he agrees with them.
Well, I think a couple of things there. One is, this is not a revelation, but I think it's very telling. He's transactional. He has I don't think he has a controlling ideology or worldview other than what's best for Donald Trump is the controlling ideology or worldview. And so being transactional, that was the whole electric car issue. He's in Michigan campaigning, telling the Michiganders and the auto workers he's for them because electric cars are trash. And what does that result in? That results in the UAW leadership feign backing Joe Biden, but then later on in the same day saying the UAW backs Donald Trump, backs Joe Biden, but the rank and file will vote their pocketbooks and support Donald Trump. And the other thing is, he is the consummate marketeer. So a lot of his tweets, I believe, are not only trolling and pandering to a specific constituency, but he's also putting out trial balloons, trying to see which way the wind is blowing so that he will know what the next thing he needs to say or what is the next thing he needs to champion. And again, that's very easy for him to do because he's a transactional individual.
I think you're absolutely right. And that's why I think that there is potential for good to happen under the Trump administration, as disappointing as a number of things he's said over the years could be, because I think he's an open book. I think he will do what he thinks will get him political benefit in the short term. And if that is something that happens to be a good thing and could benefit us overall, he might do it. And that's why I remain optimistic. And we continue to raise this idea of the peace bridge, the idea of connecting Alaska to Russia over the Bering Sea. Which is, that proposal is not new. It goes back to the days of Abraham Lincoln. Henry Charles Carey proposed it as part of the World Land Bridge policy. There was talk of it during the Wilson administration, and then it stopped when World War I broke out. And, it's been championed by a number of people. And China has emphasized that they believe in creating this peace bridge. Russia certainly would like to be more connected to the U.S. economy via Alaska. And, a bridge over the Bering Sea, I think, would be good, largely because it would transition our economy away from NATO. Right? It would transition our economy eastward, right? To have more trade happening in Alaska, to have more trade happening on the West Coast. There's a reason that when Xi Jinping visited the United States, he went to San Francisco, because California's economy is much closer to China's economy than the West Coast or than the East Coast of the United States is, right? And that I think that ultimately the future of the United States lies with the BRICS countries and with the new economy that's emerging. So building a bridge over the Bering Sea would be a way to kind of pivot the United States in a subtle way toward the new exciting economy that is emerging. One thing I said, with tariffs, the tariffs on Canada might be a good idea. I really think the idea of tariffs on China is a very bad idea, because China is where all the growth is happening. And when there's a center of economic growth happening, you don't want to cut yourself off from it. And that seems to be a lot of what Trump and Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk and others say. They say, oh, China, we got to fight China. We got to have a trade war with China. That's a really, really stupid thing to do. As you said, 900 million people lifted out of poverty. Why would we not want a piece of that to drift back to the United States? I think we would very much want that, right? I think that we should stop pandering to the World Economic Forum. I think we should stop, being a subsidy to France and Germany and Italy and other countries in the NATO alliance. And I think we should do everything we can to connect the United States with China, with Russia, et cetera.
Well, especially when most of what is consumed, or this is just a generalization to make the point, a lot of what is consumed in the United States is made in China. So those tariffs wind up just becoming nothing more than a tax that is going to be a regressive tax that is going to be disproportionately felt by the poor and the working class. Can you give me a few more minutes, Caleb? Or
of course, yeah.
Okay,
go ahead.
Okay, well, I appreciate it. Because I also wanted to quickly get to another issue. You mentioned Venezuela, and we know that that Joe Biden has done a lot to try his best to overthrow Nicolas Maduro. We know that Trump 45 tried to do a lot to overthrow Nicolas Maduro. And now the Orinoco Tribune, and I bring this up in the context of imperialism as well as colonialism or neocolonialism. The National Assembly of Venezuela has declared as persona non grata the former presidents of Bolivia, Mexico being Vicente Fox and Felipe Calderon, who have announced their intention to enter Venezuela without proper permits, as Maduro's inauguration ceremony is scheduled for, I think, Friday. So your thoughts on I don't think that those individuals are operating independent of what they consider to be United States interests. And so if you could speak to that, because I think that is incredibly telling. And again, Donald Trump coming in, Joe Biden going out, Donald Trump talking about the Panama Canal, Donald Trump talking about sanctions on Canada, Donald Trump talking about buying Greenland, and now you're trying to send these guys into Venezuela, violating Venezuelan sovereignty? Caleb Maupin.
Well, it's interesting because when Trump was first in office, he was awful to Venezuela. And there were a lot of efforts to overthrow the Venezuelan government. And there was a provocation where, they had a food truck that they were going to deliver, food to Venezuela. And then the anti-Venezuelan activists in Colombia lit it on fire themselves. And they put out all over the media, Maduro burned a food truck. That's how awful he was. And that was revealed to have been a false flag. They lit their own food truck on fire to create a provocation. Trump was trying to overthrow the Venezuelan government. And the main people doing it, we talked about, there were three guys who worked with him to do it. They were Mike Pompeo, Elliott Abrams, and John Bolton. And they were obsessed with overthrowing the Venezuelan government. And then from what we understand, according to John Bolton, after this had been going on for a few months, Donald Trump just said, I'm bored of Venezuela. I don't want to talk about it anymore. I'm tired of this. And I think he looked at the poll numbers and saw that the American people were not real excited about overthrowing Venezuela. That's just not what average Americans were really excited about. And Donald Trump just said at his cabinet meeting, he said, you know what? I'm bored. I don't want to talk about Venezuela. And John Bolton was horrified by this. Oh my gosh, got to overthrow the communist government. That's what, his whole neoconservative training is about. But Trump just said, I'm bored. Now, it was also revealed, Anya Parampil revealed in, recent reporting that apparently Trump wanted to have a meeting with Nicolas Maduro at the United Nations. And he had even tried to set one up, and John Bolton and Mike Pompeo worked to undermine him to prevent that meeting from happening. Now, what's interesting is that Mike Pompeo and John Bolton are going to have no role in Trump's administration. He considers them to have betrayed him and has said so openly. John Bolton endorsed Kamala Harris and was supporting Kamala Harris. Mike Pompeo supported Trump, but also had supported the raid on Mar-a-Lago and supported Trump being prosecuted over the classified documents. So, the two of the three people that were pushing him the hardest on Venezuela are people that are not very good in Trump's book right now, that are, on Trump's bad list, his enemies list at this point. So that seems to indicate that maybe on Venezuela, Trump might do interesting things. The other thing that I noticed is that when Donald Trump, faced an attempted assassination attempt, the assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania, Nicolas Maduro defended Trump. And I was quite shocked because, Trump has tried to overthrow Maduro, has been awful to Venezuela. But Nicolas Maduro said, the same system that killed JFK, the same system that is waging wars all over the world, just targeted Donald Trump. And Maduro gave a speech, and he basically said that he thought it was the war lobby and it was the forces that won a confrontation with Russia and Ukraine that tried to kill Donald Trump. And Nicolas Maduro made statements that were sympathetic to Trump after the attempted assassination. That's big. That's a big deal. And I mean, I feel like Maduro wouldn't be making statements like that if he didn't have some sense that perhaps Trump will want to do with Venezuela like he did with North Korea, make a deal, right? Trump wants to be known as a deal maker. Trump wants to be known as somebody who brings jobs and creates economic development. And maybe Donald Trump, it seems like if the people that were pushing him the hardest to go against Venezuela have turned against him, maybe Trump does want to change in policy on Venezuela. We will just have to see. But if you listen to Maduro has not been, leftists in America who might sympathize with Venezuela are certainly unbelievably hostile to Donald Trump. That's not the way Maduro, the leader of Venezuela, has been talking. He has been making a lot of statements saying to Trump, look, the door is open. If you want to improve things, if you want to talk to me, I'll do it. I mean, there's been a huge amount of diplomatic gesturing from Caracas towards the incoming administration. And there's no way to deny that. And so that makes me wonder. I mean, it could all amount to nothing. We don't know. But it's interesting. And it's certainly something that a lot of people in America are not noticing. It's kind of being overlooked. And the Trump people don't want to see that. Marco Rubio hates Venezuela. He's a Cuban American. He's very hostile. And Trump's camp, they think communism is their enemy. So they're certainly not making a big deal out of it. And most of the people in America that sympathize with Venezuela are leftists who are very opposed to Donald Trump. So they're certainly not making a big deal out of it. So no one's really benefiting from highlighting it. But Maduro continues to make statements indicating that he kind of likes Donald Trump, and he thinks that Donald Trump might make a deal that could improve U.S.-Venezuela relations. And that's very interesting.
Well, I think one of the operative words that you used in that explanation is diplomatic, because what Maduro's statements indicate to me are in line with a lot of what Putin has said, a lot of what President Xi Jinping says, a lot of what comes out of Iran. They are looking at the bigger picture, and they don't necessarily get caught up in personalities as much as they focus on policy. And so I think Maduro is a realist. Joe Biden's on his way out. Donald Trump's on his way in. Donald Trump is the guy I got to deal with now. And Joe Biden showed me and told me what he's about. You laying out, where all these where Pompeo is gone. And Maduro sees that. And so he says, well, now I got to deal with this guy. And I'm going to start out by trying to deal with this guy until he shows me I can't deal with him.
Yeah, well, I'll say this. The whole reason the socialist government came to power in Venezuela is because there was a big gap between Europe and the United States during the Bush administration. Hugo Chavez was, the elected president of Venezuela. Mm-hmm. He started using the oil to reconstruct Venezuela in a socialist way. And he jumped on the fact that Europe hated Bush, and he gave that speech at the UN. He called Bush the devil. And the United States was against Hugo Chavez from day one, but a lot of European countries were not, right? Mm-hmm. And what Obama did was Obama got the NATO countries to go along with the United States against Venezuela. And it was under Obama that Venezuela's money in French banks and British banks and other countries was frozen. And Obama's, great contribution was that first of all, Hugo Chavez died from cancer. After Hugo Chavez died, Barack Obama got Europe on board, and they went for the kill in Venezuela, right? 2015, 2016, it was really bad in Venezuela. And that happened under Barack Obama, and he had Europe on board, right? Because that space that had been created by the division between the United States and the NATO countries was no longer there. And it seems like Trump is somebody who wants that space to be there again, right? We remember Bush alienated Europe, remember freedom fries and all of that. And Trump seems to want that space to be there once again. So that raises some questions as if there will be a change. There never would have been, Maduro would never be in power. Hugo Chavez would never have been in power if Europe and the United States had been on the same page with Latin America from day one. But so that's an important factor we have to keep in mind there, is that there are divisions. Also, I will say that Venezuela under Maduro's leadership, you got to give that guy credit. Maduro must be one of the most effective leaders in the world, because at this point their economy is starting to improve. But what Barack Obama was able to do to Venezuela in 2015 and 2016, I mean, people were starving. There was a food crisis. People were fleeing the country. And any other government would have just completely collapsed under those circumstances. And Maduro has held the country together. He's managed to keep all the major generals on his side and have his back. And now they're coming out of it. And the USA has said Iran is not allowed to trade with Venezuela. And they've flaunted the U.S. threats. They called the USA's bluff, and they said, we're going to let Iran build supermarkets in Caracas. We're going to let Iran set up shop in Venezuela. And you can try to stop us if you want, America, but we're just going to keep doing it. And as a result, Venezuela and Iran are closer. Venezuela and Iran are closer than ever. Venezuela's economy is actually starting to grow once again, and they're nowhere near that bad situation they were. Maduro deserves a lot of credit for how he's managed this.
You're absolutely right. And what I'm about to say is in no way a swipe at Maduro, but I think it's also important to part of the explanation as to why what you said about Maduro is right is because he's a product of the Chavista revolution, and he has stuck to the tenets of the revolution, and Venezuelans see him in the light of the revolution. If Maduro were to start to deviate from those principles and precepts, they would throw him out in a day. But it's because he's a product of, he adheres to, he believes in the revolution, and has not been a traitor to that he has been able to have the success, and the Venezuelans have given him the space to operate that they've given him. Your thoughts?
Oh, well, he's a bus driver. I mean, he's the leader of the bus drivers union. I mean, he's a union organizer. This is a guy who ran the labor union of Venezuela's bus drivers for many years. I mean, I've been in his presence before. He's a very tall man, and he's an organizer. I mean, he's been a lifelong organizer. He was at one point, so he was never in the Communist Party of Venezuela. At one point, I understand he was in another communist party called the Partido Bandera Roja, which was like a Maoist or a more hardline group that was formed in the 70s. And he was a leader of that organization for a while. And he was just a very important leader of the bus drivers union. And he was a very effective organizer, and he was in one communist group for a while, and he was independent for a while. And then when Hugo Chavez emerged as an important leader, he was a big supporter of Hugo Chavez and his movement. And, he really was capable of getting the job done. And that's the strength of the Venezuelan government. When I went to Caracas, when I went to different parts of Venezuela, there is a network of community organizations that support the government. And that is why the government is still in power. There's a layer of people that are ready to die for the revolution, that have they have their Bolivarian militias that are independent.
And that's why the United States can't just invade Venezuela, because the people will defend their country.
Yeah, and Maduro is very much a product of that political machine that backed up Chavez. And so that's where his effectiveness and strength comes from.
Final question. Again, you've given me more time than agreed, and I greatly appreciate it. And I want to quickly get to you. We've talked about him for a minute, but Elon Musk is now, as being reported, roiling European politics, throwing grenades into Europe's political mainstream over issues ranging from immigration to free speech, he's weighing in a series of incendiary social media posts, far right in politics, accusing the minister of being a rapist, all this kind of stuff. Do you see in this context Elon Musk operating as Elon Musk, or is he also operating as an emissary of Donald Trump?
Well, the new right in Europe, right, whether it's Marine Le Pen in France or the Brexit movement and some of the right-wing groups in Britain, they're kind of like Trump. They represent people that have a different agenda than the overall NATO imperialist, World Economic Forum agenda, right? And so he's pandering to them, and he's showing support for them and hinting that the White House will be sympathetic. I must say that, when I saw Elon Musk defending Tommy Robinson, I just rolled my eyes. Tommy Robinson is one of the biggest fools. You listen to the guy, he just hates Muslims, right? I mean, and he's almost a caricature of like a racist working class British person. I hate Muslims. See, I don't like them. I think they should move to another country. I don't much care for Muslims. I mean, I'm just nothing about Tommy Robinson is at all redeemable. He named his organization the English Defense League after the Jewish Defense League, the Zionist group that went around beating up sympathizers with Palestine. I really, there's nothing about Tommy Robinson that I find at all, redeemable or admirable. I find him to just be a racist, ignorant person pandering to racist ignorance. But that said, the new right, the people who supported Brexit in the UK, Marine Le Pen in France, the Alternative for Germany party, they represent, kind of like Trump here, wealthy capitalists that are not on board with the whole English agenda, with the whole global imperialist agenda. So because of that, I try to view this in an economic lens. But yeah, that's kind of where I'm at with all of this. The new right in Europe is very much a mixed bag. It is, there used to be a very strong left in Europe that was anti-NATO, etc. And that left has been thoroughly eroded. And a lot of that has to do with French intelligence. And I've written a lot about that. It's kind of a topic I've delved deep into, but the French intelligence services very much, groomed and courted a lot of very important communist leaders around the world. They had a program where, like, the Red Brigade terrorists of Italy were coming into France and were given asylum. And there's hundreds of Red Brigade terrorists, former, bombers and killers from Italy who murdered people, who are living in France now and have been, courted by French intelligence. And because of that, the so-called left of Europe, that was at one point aligned with the Soviet Union, at this point has become basically pro-NATO, and if not blatantly pro-NATO and blatantly defending the European Union and the NATO establishment, completely impotent and ineffective. So because of that, the right is kind of filling the void. The Alternative for Germany party, etc. There are some exceptions, people like Sarah Wagenknecht in Germany, people like George Galloway in Britain. There are certain people that have come out of the left that have maintained their anti-imperialist principles, but largely this big entity of the left that was anti-imperialist in Western European politics is no longer that. So the right is kind of filling the void. And I mean, you could say a similar thing about the United States. So, I try to look at the economic interest behind it, but I shake my head at a lot of what I see Musk saying. I mean, I have no love for Tommy Robinson. Let me put it that way.
Really quickly, I know this was the final question. I want to get back to the tariffs. The practical, if Trump has any success in implementing this tariff regime, the practical implications on everyday Americans, because again, this is going to be, as he's talking about lowering taxes on for wealthy Americans, he's going to be imposing taxes on all Americans through what he calls the tariff regime.
Yeah, well, the idea of the tariffs is to boost American corporations because they'll be, their competitors will be having a harder time importing products. They'll be able to offer lower prices, and it'll boost American corporations. Again, there is this illusion among conservatives and libertarians that if the ultra rich people have more money, we'll all get rich as a result. It doesn't work that way. If ultra rich people have more money, it tends to sit in their bank account until they think they can make money from investing it. That's
why George H.W. called it voodoo economics. Trickle down economics doesn't work.
Yeah, you and I, if we have more money, we spend it. However, if the ultra rich have more money, it just sits in a bank account unless they can reinvest it. And while it sits there in the bank account, it gradually loses value over time due to inflation. And that's the case. They talk about the golden horde and I mean, when people are multimillionaires and billionaires, most of their money is not for their personal pleasure or their personal expenses. Maybe they buy 12 houses or 20 houses, but they can only, most of their money is just sitting there to be reinvested to get a return on their investment. So the idea that giving the rich people more money is going to make America more prosperous, it doesn't work out. You want average people to have more money. And that means jobs, schools, education. It means infrastructure. It means investing in the population. And you can't do that if you cut. You can't do that if you cut. So there's an interesting 4 years ahead of us, to say the least. But I hope that at least American foreign policy can improve.
And to that point, what I take away from you in all the conversations that we have is you're not a binary thinker.
No.
And so you don't say, oh, on January 20th, Donald Trump is sworn in, there's nothing we can do over the next 4 years. You are looking at, and you've used this word yourself, openings. You see spaces of opening or spaces opening, and you are choosing to operate in those spaces. Is that a fair summary of this conversation?
Yes. And I will just say this very quickly, that if Donald Trump does good things and there is not a huge enthusiastic applause and support for him, he's not going to keep doing those things. So if Donald Trump does anything good, I think we have a responsibility to loudly support it and show that there is public support for it. If he does one good move, I mean, if he starts those peace talks on the Korean Peninsula, if he investigates the FBI for their violation of American civil liberties, if he makes a peace deal and ends the conflict in Ukraine, we need to loudly support it, no matter how we feel about him in general. It's not about assessing his character and, being thinking Trump is the best guy. If Trump takes good moves and no one supports him, he won't continue to take good moves. So my organization, the Center for Political Innovation, we are prepared to support anything good that Donald Trump does. And I think that should be the attitude. If there is good things that happen, we should support it.
And Rumination with Andrew says, it won't improve. The U.S. is on a quest for full spectrum dominance. But what spaces are opening, Wilmer? Well, he says he's going to bring an end to the Ukraine war. We'll see. He says he wants to end the conflict between North and South Korea. We'll see. There is a possibility that relations with Venezuela could improve. We will see. And if anybody sees those things as positive, then you need to be out championing those things. And if he then reneges on those things or does something different, then you have to speak up loudly in opposition against them. That, to me, is real politics. Caleb, take us out.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're on the same page. So, we've got our work cut out for us, and we need to build an anti-imperialist movement in America. We need a government of action to fight for working families.
Caleb Maupin, as always, my brother, thank you so much for joining me today. Greatly, greatly appreciate it. Happy New Year. And I'm going to do everything in my power to see you at the Hilton Garden Inn in D.C. on the 20th of this month.
Very good. Thank you.
Folks, thank you all so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. Stay tuned. New episode coming tomorrow. Please follow and subscribe. Leave a review. Share the show. Follow us on social media. You can find all the links below in the show description. Remember that this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge, because talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. See you all tomorrow. Until then, I am Wilmer Leon. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. Stay warm, especially if you're on the East Coast. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.